How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. There was once an infamous privateer named William Kidd, who became better known as Captain Kidd because Captain sounds way more gangster than William. Kidd had quite a wild life, and I wanted to depict one of the lesser-known but most wild moments of all, which is his narrow escape from a zombie dragon off the coast of Nova Scotia. And I'll do my best to remain true to the source material, most of which I pulled straight from my imagination. I was gifted this model kit by a patron over a year ago, hence the dust, and finally decided to break it out and give it a whirl. The last time I put together a ship like this, I did almost everything wrong per model shipbuilding standards, so this time around I did want to improve my accuracy by at least 25%. The ship has a lot of cannons, and about a third of them were molded in one piece, and the rest required assembly. I believe that's because the unassembled cannons had better detail, while only the barrels of the molded ones would be visible in the end, but I'm not exactly sure. To be honest, unlike Star Wars ships and Gundam, I have very little understanding of the anatomy of old sailing ships. I'm more surprised by their construction than I probably should be. I guess my foundational reference for pirate ships was a Lego set I had when I was a kid. Should probably be updated. After the construction of the deck assembly, I glued the low poly cannons in place, and I made a deck sandwich. Now that I'm looking at it, it's actually more of a taco, if you follow the cube rule. And next, it was time to glue on the decorations and the trim details, starting with this poop deck tiara. I'm sure it has another non-obvious technical name that I don't know, but I think tiara is a good description for what it is. I then moved around the ship, having fun, adding all the little details, and was pleasantly surprised to find some little decorative guys with their pet seahorses to put on the back. I then installed the rudder and the cannon window shutters, which are obviously all open because the cannons are sticking out of them prepared to fire at enemies. But unfortunately, I don't think any of them can aim high enough to hit a flying dragon. After that, I constructed and installed Prince Eric's Sea Witch skewer, which goes on the front of the ship, followed by the tender and the other masts. In my high seas battle that I made a few years ago, I referred to these as the Fourmast, the Fivemast, and the Sixmast, which I thought was pretty funny. But sometimes things are funnier to me than they are to other people. But that's alright. After the masts were in place, it was time to cut out some sails. I like that these sails aren't fabric, but rather vacuum molded plastic, which means they'll hold their shape and look full sail even if the wind isn't blowing in the opposite direction. Before I glue those sails in place, I did have a few other things to do, including taking it outside and giving it a coat of primer. After giving it a coat of matte black, I realized it was going to be easier to get this thing to stay upright while I painted if I chopped the bottom off, something I was going to have to do eventually anyways. After marking out the water line on the ship, I threw on some safety glasses and went crazy with my rotary tool. After the bottom of the ship had been removed, I snipped the now exposed masts so that those were not on the table. It's time to break out the airbrush. I started the paint job with a combination of tans, browns, blues, and greens, which was supposed to make it look somewhat like wood, but it was probably unnecessary as I did change directions multiple times throughout the painting process. I find it difficult to stick with one painting technique or idea, which can cause some issues. I do fine, usually, if I stick to a plan, but more often than not, I stumble toward the end goal, go past it, backtrack, approach it from another angle, mess it up again, and then stop once I have salvaged the mess I've made. All that to be said, I would recommend having a plan and sticking with it. To get the ropes black again, I used a piece of the instructions as a mask and I airbrushed them. And as you will see in just a moment, the color of the ship changes dramatically from one shot to the next, and that's part of the salvaging I was talking about earlier. I glued the sails in place and gave them some shading and weathering using the airbrush. And then it was finally time for the moment that we've all been dreading, or the moment at least that I have been dreading, and that is the rigging. When I built and painted 2 of these plastic pirate ships back to back and assembled them in a high seas battle, I skimped on the rigging, and I did mention that. Does that look fun to you? My minimal rope work last time caused a marginal amount of outrage amongst model shipbuilders in the comments. So this time around, I did decide to apply most of the 25% improvement allowance to this step. And I must say that as much as I didn't want to do the rigging on this ship, because it's barely going to be visible in the end, and because I knew it would take up at least half of my entire allotted building time for this project, which it did, it was more fun than I thought it would be, and worth doing. So I have to humbly admit that the shipbuilding people were probably right. The last details to add were the flags, which I primed red outside, then applied my water decals to, which were old and fragile. So an extra long soak and some microsol did the trick. Once the flags have been glued in place, the ship was done, and it's at this point that we depart from strictly historical. I grabbed this zombie dragon from the store who has the nickname the Defiler. Probably means he's a pretty bad guy. I don't know much about him. Except he does have guts exposed, which I've never seen on a dragon model before. In spite of the questionable nickname and the guts, this kit was very nice to put together, and I have found that to be the case with everything that Archon Studios produces. In a video I did about a year ago with Chicken's Tabletop Crafting, I suspended a dragon and used the standoff as the flames coming out of its mouth, and I'm going to be doing the same thing with this build today. I cut up some wooden blocks, which will be reinforcements for my copper pipe, and then I found a placement for the ship that I was happy with. After that, I drilled a hole through it, and an equally sized hole through the blocks and the wooden base. The drill bit that I used to make the holes was just smaller than the copper pipe, meaning that a nice press fit later on will ensure that this thing isn't bouncing around once the dragon gets put in place. I then got the battery housing and switch situation figured out underneath the board and moved on to the lights themselves. I drilled a few holes in the copper pipe and then ran my wire through, pulling it out of each hole, snipped it, stripped it, and soldered my filaments in place. I'm out of my long, flexible noodle filaments, which I would usually use for this, but this method worked just fine for this time. I set the lights aside, and it was time to move on to the next step, which was to create the water. This method is an excellent one that I learned a long time ago from a channel called Scale-a-Ton. It's more approachable and easier to redo if you make mistakes than something like resin. Basically just foil and paint. After forming the main wave structures using noodles of crumpled up foil, place one large sheet of foil, which has been wrapped and unwrapped gently over top. Then you massage that into the shape of the swells and glue in place. And it's easy enough to go back later and carve away any of the excess foil that goes over the sides with a nice sharp utility knife. For many other awesome scale modeling techniques like this one, you should go check out the channel Scale-a-Ton. I will link that channel below. I forgot to do a layer of Mod Podge, which does help give it a little bit more strength, but skipped straight to the white primer, which I followed with light green, applied more heavily between the waves. After that, I mixed up a dark blue with a glaze medium, and I applied it to the whole thing till it was tinted to my liking. The final step was to give it a coat of gloss or semi-gloss varnish. And you can also go back and tickle the peaks of the waves with some white, depending on how choppy you want it to look. While we wait for the gloss varnish to dry, it's time to paint the dragon. I primed him fully black using an acrylic primer, then progressively added lighter and lighter colors of red and then eventually pink and green to establish a nice zombie-esque base coat. Now, if you'll remember the way I painted the ship earlier, and my warning against that, I followed my own advice, and I did not paint the dragon that way. Instead, I made a plan in my head, and I stuck with it, and I think it definitely paid off. Once all the shading and midtones had been established, I went back in with my highlight colors and began separating the sections of the dragon that had become slightly blended because of the airbrushing step. Even though I am very happy with the way that the dragon turned out, especially compared to the boat, the paint job is fairly muted. I would prefer a little bit more saturation and contrast next time. And luckily for this diorama, this is a zombie dragon, meaning a less saturated, lifeless look actually kind of works. With almost everything painted, it was time to start assembling things. I lowered the boat into position, then I pressed my light-up dragon standoff into position, firmly enough to go into the hole, but not so firm as to break the lights. I then glued the ship into position as well. With the ship and the standoff in position and nice and snug, I could then move underneath the base and get all of the wiring connected, and then finally throw in some batteries. And it was at this point that I remembered that I hadn't painted the crew, so I went back and did that quickly. They're too tiny, and I know that they're not going to be very visible in the end anyway, so I didn't apply the 25% improvement rule to them. They admittedly got a pretty minimal paint job. Once I had removed them from the runner, I glued them into their positions. And at some point throughout this build, you may have asked yourself, why would you have taken this nice real-life pirate ship and added an undead dragon to it? Undead dragons don't even have a proper throat to breathe fire, so it's completely unrealistic. And the reality is, as fun as a perfectly normal historical diorama is to look at, there are plenty of other people doing that far better than me on YouTube. And I wanted to answer the age-old question. What would it look like if Captain Kidd fought off a zombie dragon before he was captured and executed for piracy? And now instead of using AI or your imagination to come up with an image, you can just look at this as your reference. The last thing to do was to glue the dragon into position, and after that, I called it good. And that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.